I've been a taxi driver for 5 years. Night shifts are my thing. The city streets empty out, neon signs reflect off the wet pavement, and the few pedestrians hurry home. That suits me just fine. Fewer traffic jams, fewer conversations. Tonight seemed no different from hundreds before. The rain had been drizzling for hours, sliding down the windshield. The wipers squeaked softly as they cleared the water. The radio played quietly, creating a cozy illusion in this cold city. I was just finishing my lukewarm gas station coffee when a new ride request popped up. The address was on the outskirts, a place where people rarely called for a cab. Sighing, I hit accept and pulled away from the curb. The farther I drove, the fewer streetlights there were. The houses looked older, the streets narrower. Finally, my GPS announced, "You have arrived." I looked around. No one. I was about to cancel the ride when I noticed a figure in the distance, illuminated by my headlights. A woman stood by the roadside, head slightly tilted, as if hesitating. I leaned forward to get a better look. She wore a long dark coat and a hat, something no one had worn for decades. Her clothes looked outdated, but what unsettled me more was that they were soaked through, as if she had been standing in the rain for hours. Slowly, she stepped forward, opened the back door, and got into the car. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She turned her head slightly, and in the dim glow of the dashboard, I saw her pale face. "To the house by the bridge," she said softly. Her voice was muted, as if drowned out by the rain itself. I nodded, entered the address into the GPS, and pressed the gas pedal. A thought flickered through my mind. I've never heard of that place before. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The woman sat motionless, staring out the window. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the silhouettes of wet trees. Streetlights flickered dimly through the fog. "Is the house by the bridge far?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She barely nodded. "Not far," she replied softly. Her voice was strange, muted, as if her words were being swallowed by the rain before they even reached me. A feeling of unease crept over me. Most passengers either stared at their phones or made small talk. But this woman, she just sat there, unnervingly still. I turned the radio down, focusing on the road. Yet something kept pulling my eyes back to the mirror. Her face was blurry, not literally, but as if the light didn't catch on her features properly, making them hard to define. Every time I looked, she seemed slightly different. I blinked, shaking off the thought, probably just the dim lighting and my tiredness. Suddenly, my GPS beeped and rerouted. I glanced at the screen. First, it said 15 minutes to destination, then 20 minutes, then 10 minutes. I frowned. That wasn't normal. The woman leaned forward slightly. "Are you familiar with this road?" she asked. I shrugged. "More or less. I don't drive here often, but I think we'll get there fine." She leaned back again. "Not everyone finds their way back," she whispered. A chill ran down my spine. I whipped my head toward the mirror. "What?" She was silent, sitting still, gazing out the window as if she hadn't spoken at all. The air in the car suddenly felt colder. I glanced at my hands. The skin was covered in goosebumps. Then I noticed something that made my breath hitch. My breath was visible. I cranked up the heater, but the warm air did nothing. The cold in the car felt unnatural, like it was seeping from somewhere deeper than the night outside. The woman remained motionless, gazing into the darkness beyond the window. My GPS beeped again, recalculating. 30 minutes to destination. My grip on the wheel tightened. 30 minutes? It had just said 10. I tapped the screen, but the map was frozen. The road ahead stretched endlessly into the night, swallowed by the thickening fog. I risked another glance in the mirror. She was still there, but something was off. She hadn't moved an inch, yet she seemed closer somehow, as if the darkness had crept in around her, making the space between us smaller. I swallowed hard. Are we sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, in that same hushed, distant voice, she murmured. We're almost there. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned my attention back to the road just as my headlights illuminated an old wooden sign ahead. Bridge closed. Do not enter. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly before stopping just short of the sign. The bridge beyond it was barely visible through the mist. The wood looked old, warped by time and weather. I frowned. This bridge wasn't on the map. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the wheel. We can't go this way, I said, turning slightly to face her. She moved for the first time since getting in. Slowly, her head turned toward me. Her voice was barely a whisper. We've already arrived. My pulse pounded in my ears. Beyond the bridge, through the shifting fog, a house loomed in the distance. I was sure it hadn't been there a moment ago. I stared at the house beyond the bridge, my breath caught in my throat. It looked wrong, like a blurry photograph, its edges shifting ever so slightly. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing. I turned back to my passenger. This is your house? I asked, my voice barely steady. She gave the slightest nod. Something deep inside me screamed, leave, now. I gripped the gear shift, ready to throw the car into reverse. Then she lifted her hand. She wasn't pointing at the house. She was pointing at me. I swallowed hard. What? She spoke softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. You need to go inside. A wave of nausea rolled through me. And no, I stammered. I think I'll stay right here. Silence. Then, without a sound, she was gone. I blinked. The back seat was empty. A dark, wet stain remained where she had been sitting. An outline of a human figure, soaked into the fabric. My stomach twisted. My hands were ice cold against the wheel. I yanked the door handle and stumbled out into the rain, my breath coming fast and shallow. The house still loomed ahead. The front door was slightly open. From inside, a pair of eyes stared back at me. A frail old man stood in the doorway, his face hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes flickered between me and the car, then widened in horror. You brought her back? He whispered. The rain blurred my vision. What? I managed to say. The man took a shaky step forward. Where is she? He demanded, his voice thick with fear. I hesitated. She was just in my car, I said, glancing back at the vehicle. The door was still open. The dark stain remained, but she was gone. The man let out a breath, half relief, half terror. Then he turned his hollow gaze back to me. You don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. She died 30 years ago. At that moment, something slammed shut. I spun around. My car door was closed, and in the back seat, she was sitting there again. Only this time, she was smiling. A wave of pure terror crashed over me. She sat in the back seat, exactly where she had been before, only now she was smiling. A small, unnatural smile, lips just barely curled. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. The old man took a step closer, his frail frame trembling. You shouldn't have come here, he whispered. You shouldn't have brought her back. I turned to him, my pulse hammering. What the hell is going on? I demanded. Who is she? His sunken eyes locked onto mine. My daughter, he croaked. She drowned in the river under this bridge. 30 years ago. The rain suddenly felt colder. I whipped back toward the car. My breath hitched. The woman was no longer in the back seat. I felt it before I saw it. Presence. A shadow stretching toward me. Then, just behind me, so close I could feel the icy breath on my neck, came a whisper. Not everyone finds their way back. I spun around. Nothing. The only sound was the rain, pounding against the pavement. I turned to the old man. He was staring past me, toward the bridge, his face filled with dread. Slowly, I followed his gaze. And then I saw her, standing on the bridge, dripping wet, watching me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for my car, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the gas pedal. The car skidded backward onto the wet road. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The bridge was gone. No house, no old man, no woman, just an empty stretch of road behind me, swallowed by the fog. My heart pounded as I sped away, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the bright city streets, that I finally exhaled. I pulled over, hands still shaking. Then, in the silence, I felt it. A cold, damp sensation on the back of my neck. I looked at the rearview mirror. There, on the fogged-up glass, was a single, wet handprint. I was no longer alone.